Okay, hello and welcome to episode 68 of the Follow Mechanical Turks project. Today, I think we're going to take a look at the revision to the conclusion of the second draft so that we can get that posted. And then we can shift into the third piece. We already, in our previous episode, had on a special guest to talk with us about some potential frameworks that might help with that third product as we look at the theoretical operations of MTurk.
Yeah.
I guess that's the gist of it. Did you have anything to contribute, or am I missing anything?
No, that's it. Yeah. I was just the conclusion, right? Which attempts to kind of put a little bit of a button on this piece, but also, gesture towards the next one.
Okay, let me share my screen here.
Do that.
So we can see here in the conclusion, it looks like the revisions kind of build off that.
Yeah, I looking at it, I think the nice little bulleted, list that kind of comes after that, and then building on that, right? Collectively, these observations situate readability in a context of telling, a reciprocal process of signifying and ordering shared by humans and machines. The human intelligence task, which overtly appears on MTurk, but is also latent and captures digital citizenship in many other forms, becomes a task in which acts of reading, things we read, and readability itself are at stake. And then sort of wanting to build on that notion of at stake. And then because we opened up with a series of, news items about GPT-3, we discussed in the past, there's a more recent one by
Johnson.
Yeah, that talks about it in terms of its beyond just the sort of anxieties that we outline at the first, right? That these right, the notion of is it true intelligence, right? The sort of true artificial distinction that we've been working through.
Yeah.
But also, right, it's some of the similar anxieties that are in those earlier ones. But what's interesting, and that's what I'm still trying to figure out how to build in without going too far down the road, is that Stephen Johnson's language around it much more explicitly ask for a kind of rhetorical understanding of it. So he's the one that cites the uses language like blind mimicry or the stochastic parrot, and really thinking about sort of authenticity as a link to sort of authorship, right? The notion of sort of true human intelligence. And so, right, so this notion of other critics, right? This quote where he writes, other critics believe that the software like GPT-3 will forever remain compromised by the biases and propaganda and misinformation in the data that has been trained on, meaning that using it for anything other than parlor tricks will always be irresponsible. So, right, so then writing, if something like GPT-3 is indeed a parlor trick, a mere shadow of true human intelligence, then the use of it becomes obviously questionable. If we know it's nothing more than a stochastic parrot, then why would we ever take it seriously? And more important, how could we take it seriously? So the idea is that, right, our wager has been and will continue to be in future research that to take a stochastic parrot or a Turker seriously is to productively acknowledge that all the key terms here, the human, intelligence, authorship, readability, are moving targets. They are, in other words, precisely what is at stake in their very telling. It is through taskscapes in which different actors swap properties that those properties come to be.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, there's a world in which that's we could just stop there. But then there's this, and maybe saving it, right? Because what's really interesting about that article, and I think I forget, maybe I've excised it. There's a moment at the end of it where he's writing about training how do we train it to be good citizens?
Right.
Basically just raises almost explicitly the specter of, the Richard Lanham's Q question, right?
Quintillion, yeah.
Right, the good man speaking well, and of course begs it, right? Because doesn't all the things that are actually at stake are presumed not to be at stake. And so the move that I'm making there, which borrows from a move I made at the salsa conference where Dr. Singh was also at, is that there's this salsa.
Sorry, that was just like, no, but you said where he was also at.
Yeah, that sentence really petered out, didn't it? He was also there.
Anyway.
Right. So there's this interesting facet where essentially anxieties about GPT-3, but even Turkers, right, are weirdly echo worries about rhetoric generally, which is right. It's lack of a ideal form or right authenticity or reality, right? So the notion that rhetoric is always somehow artificial.
Yeah.
Right, that it's not the real thing. And so, right, so the joke I make in there is, right, as far as philosophy is concerned, rhetoric is just artificial philosophy, right? And so is that, but that I think is interesting and maybe something to pursue in the third one. So, it's always one of those things like don't introduce something new in the conclusion. And I think by virtue of the way that this kind of article works, that really it's the contextualization section that really does the work that I think we would sometimes think would need to happen in a conclusion piece, if that makes sense, right? Given the sort of our modified MRAD format that we're going with. So really thinking that maybe that it just sort of stops here.
And then this material gets pushed to the third or ported to contextualization, or
I think just is saved for the third one, or at least is potentially something in there, or we scrap it and don't use it at all, and it was just a way to write ourselves into it. But I feel like any expansion of this, I mean, the only other caveat I have here is that we start with GPT-3 and end with it. So I'm also a little worried too that the Turker kind of disappears, and it may be that this litany, right, that to take a stochastic parrot or a Turker seriously. But I think given what we've said, right, the idea is the whole notion of what's a Turker is, are they actually doing intelligence tasks, or are they merely working as bots or machines? But I think there's enough of a connecting thread there that I think we can see them as related activities, at least for the purposes of a conclusion that tries to wrap it up a little bit.
Yeah, and I haven't read through it yet, but yeah, I mean, those are relevant questions. And so, maybe I can take a look and see what a different pair of eyes thinks about in terms of, what should be included there versus what could be pushed to something else.
Yeah.
But yeah, that, right. Because I mean, clearly simmering underneath, and I'm sure this is in the material already, is the, the fact that saying we can't take GPT-3 seriously because it acts in these ways that are potentially, the fear is that they're potentially dangerous. I mean, as Johnson's pointing out, it's like you can't really, why it has to be a parlor trick, right? Why it has to be the chess automaton is because if you ever put it in a position of real power, it has these weird blind spots. I mean, that's kind of sometimes the language that, and I don't know if I sent this to you or if I just added it to something else, but there's always these, but there was just a recent one of, I think it was dispensing medical advice. It was like, counseling patients. And, at one point it suggests suicide. It says, person's complaining about these medical ailments. At one point the thing says, have you considered killing yourself? And so it's just sort of a stark, example of, oh, well, gosh, um,
Yeah,
we can't.
what if there was a doctor out there that encouraged and helped patients to commit suicide?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the point, that such things exist. And so, I mean, simmering underneath the fears that Johnson, and I haven't read his piece, but I mean, knowing him, I suspect this isn't his critique, is, well, hey, we can't put this thing in control. I suspect what he's doing is criticizing that position by saying, well, but humans do exactly that, right? I mean, it's like, yeah, we can't put those bots in control because they have these huge gaps, but it's like, yeah, but that's also human.
Surprisingly not.
Really.
Yeah.
That's what I would expect from him.
Yeah. No, it very much right, the notion of I mean, it's sort of implied, but right, it's not as strongly voiced as you put it, right? That there is, that he doesn't necessarily, I mean, at least not in an obvious way, make that leap that, like, aren't we just describing the
Yes.
general problem of communicating and epistemology and right, like,
Yeah. I mean, well, those are
you're only as well, because it would compel him, right, if he's got a certain kind of humanist instinct, right? The idea that human beings are simply a function of the data set that they've learned on.
right.
That would be, you'd have to at least entertain that idea to then make the connection that what artificial intelligence is doing is right, that our and again, which is surprising from a guy that writes a book like Emergence.
Yeah. Well,
but he always sort of, we may have talked about this already. Basically my stump speech about Stephen Johnson is he's always got a final chapter problem.
yeah. Right. Yeah.
Which is right, spends a whole book making a compelling case about emergence as the phenomenon by which everything comes to be, and then writes a final chapter where he's like, so I like things that are more emergent than other things.
Right.
So I don't like top-down systems because they're not emergent. But I'm like, but
right.
surely top-down systems emerged from somewhere, right? You've just said this is how stuff works. So he wants to use, right, as a lot of, I think, people with particular philosophical instincts, right? They want to immediately move from the descriptive to then the normative, right? That this ontological argument I've made can now be used to sort good behavior from bad behavior.
Yeah, it would be this. Maybe this is a sloppy metaphor, but it would be as though if the last chapter of Darwin's Origin of Species was, so yeah, it's cool the way some organisms, are selected by their environment, but I prefer the ones that are created by God in a perfect state, right? It would be this kind of weight, but the entire thing was about, this is how stuff happens. You can't then parse up, but this only happens in certain arenas. And I don't like the ones where, it doesn't happen. It's like that undercuts the entire premise.
So, and that's a thing he tends to do. It could be like an audience, right? He's okay. Now what's the, I think partially because of the circles he runs in. Okay, now how can I use this to start a business?
Yeah,
right.
Well, yeah, and I mean, and not to dismiss, because I've often said, like, if I wasn't in academia, I mean, I like his career, where it's like, that's what I would like to do if I weren't an academic, because mostly what he's doing is like pop sci, kind of following, because he has like this scope, right? Where he's sort of following these different intellectual things that it seems like he's just kind of interested in something. Is like, all right, well then I'll look at that for a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if it's writing as pop sci, it means it's gonna, be framed differently than the kind of academic expectations we have for sort of a more critical examination of that.
Yeah, but my sense too is it's my instincts, maybe they're not less generous. I don't think they're less, but is I think that's part of it. But I also think he's got some, philosophical commitments that bend towards that way, right? I think there's a way you could conclude a pop science book like that. Matt, I just read or assigned last semester Carl Zimmer's The Edge of Life, which is really great. Like the idea that the definition of life is something that scientists develop to study it, not a thing that they have And so the book doesn't conclude with, so now here's how we should go about doing it, right? It's a very engaging, it doesn't make the move that I think Stephen Johnson oftentimes makes, which is, well, now we can use this to sort the good ones from the bad ones.
Yeah.
And there's like, well, it's the begging the question thing at the end. So, but anyway, but it's, because there's even a moment in there where he talks about how do we train it so that it's a good citizen.
Yeah.
But
And in a sense, I'm sympathetic to that in the rhetorical sense of, yes, but we have to do something, right? I mean, it's like we can't leave Quintilian's notion. I mean, right? I mean, Lanham points out that it's like, yeah, Quintilian is question begging, right? But by saying, is it training, the good man? It's leaving aside the, where that conception comes from. But at the same point, it's like, yeah, but I have a school to run and we have citizens, And so I'm sympathetic to the notion of, yeah, I realize this is utterly fraught. At the same point, it's like we got, even not making a choice here is still making a choice.
Yeah. But the idea in this then is what I liked about Dr. Singh last time, right, in that article, is that, but you have to use that materiality has to be part of the way that you think through these questions. Right, because what he's thinking about is, right, how do we put a program into them that makes them good? Not how do we negotiate with them what citizenship might be in the context of artificial intelligence, right? We already know what good citizenship is.
Yeah.
Training is an act of bringing you into line with an already known.
Yeah.
Right. So it could be that, like, oh yeah, I'm running a school here, and what the school does is it thinks through the question of what citizenship is, and it considers that to be one and the same with citizenship training. You can train people in citizenship wherein the question of citizenship remains open, which is more like the lines of practice. I mean, I'm thinking of that Bill Readings, right, The University in Ruins, where he talks about the university as a place where that's where the question of that is allowed to be experimented on, right? That it's, in many ways, it's practice as opposed to something like, I don't know, training or anyway. But yeah, so that I think then is where the conclusion ends up, is that our instinct on this is that whatever those answers are going to be, you've got to think with it through and with that stuff, as opposed to platonically needing to have it ahead of time.
Right. And then
which is, anyway, it's kind of interesting. I mean, this is probably, a latent connection in the piece. It's also kind of what Turkers bristle at, which is academics coming in already knowing what good labor, good things looks like, and then finding all the ways in which Turkers aren't doing that, which is in many ways to totally ignore the work that Turkers are doing in that task space. I already know what labor relations ought to look like, and this doesn't look like it, so you guys need to stop doing this. And Turkers are like, shut up.
Yeah. It's interesting because that manifests in a lot of ways that are, so, I mean, here's an example, right? This is right now coming up because of the World Cup. You watching any of the World Cup?
Yeah.
So, I mean, a latent conversation that's going on right now is something like, are human rights transcultural?
Right.
And I say this because the host country, and I don't think it's controversy at all to say that, it's demonstrable to point out that international soccer and FIFA are almost irredeemably corrupt. I mean, that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a controversial statement. I think that's, because they've had so many convictions of.
Right.
This.
A lot of this is not allegedly.
Yeah, I mean, it's not allegedly. It's in court record. But also, it's like, I don't know if there's really any impetus to change. It's just like, no, this is a corrupt enterprise. I mean, it runs through graft. I mean, that's how this works. I mean, that's the rules of the game. You guys
like soccer, you deal with it.
Well, and I bring this up because, like, right now it's in Qatar. And so there's been a lot of dialogue about how they're curtailing expected behaviors at the game, most notably things like, not allowing alcohol, despite the fact that Budweiser is a major sponsor. I don't know if is Budweiser owned by InBev. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And other things related to sort of morality codes. And so there's been a contingent of indigenous folks to that country saying, well, these are our guidelines. You're guests here, come here and abide by our guidelines. And the sort of blowback is, yeah, but human rights, particularly things like involving LGBT community, right? Where this is an environment that is not friendly to them.
Yeah.
Where it's like, yeah, but these are human rights issues. And, women, we expect, a sort of trans-cultural expectation of this is how women. And so there's this real interesting, but utterly, it's a conversation you can't have, which is like, are human rights, like any right, utterly situated, right? That there are no human rights. Wake up.
Right.
Maybe death is maybe our only human right. But I'm not committed to that being transhistorical either.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, those things we believe are human rights are legally defined largely through documents and court practice. That there is nothing magic that you get by being born a human or born at all. And so these are all constructs that we're defending. And I don't think that devalues them.
No.
But it manifests as this conversation. I think, kind of, it's tangential, but it's related to these notions of what counts as like transcultural, right? Like labor rights, as you point out.
Right.
It's one thing to come to Turk and say, yeah, but these are just basic labor rights. It's like, well, not here, they're not, because this market is weird. And yeah, from your perspective, it seems like we're sympathizers, we're have sort of the sympathy with our oppressor, Stockholm syndrome, but it's like, well, that's the only way this thing functions.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, just to add to that too, I just saw, and this may not be true, so we can edit this, we can fix this in post.
No edits.
But the Chinese broadcasts of the World Cup have fewer crowd shots because people aren't wearing masks, aren't mandated.
Interesting.
So.
Yeah, subtle. It manifests in ways both subtle and overt, right? It's overt when it's like a gay person, got arrested because they were there, or so. Notably, they were forbidding anything that smacked of being a rainbow. You couldn't wear anything that, was too colorful.
Yeah.
But then it's also, subtle things like that, and ones that are kind of, in a way, funny, although also horrible. Did you see that a British fan tried to show up wearing Crusader gear?
Yes.
And and they're like, yeah, but this is typical. We do this. It's like you're in the part of the world that may have some associate.
That guy was where
it's like kind of a teachable moment there, where it's like, yeah, man, but it's like it's like showing up to a game here dressed as like a slave master carrying a whip because your team is the rebels, which I'm using that as a hyperbolic example, although it's going on constantly with things like
that seems like something that has definitely happened.
Yeah, I'm actually using a comparatively tame example, but it's like, yeah, those things have lineages. To you, it's just a fun mascot, but it's an insidious paradigm that has led to a devaluing, in that case, of the Middle East. Even calling it the Mideast.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, you should stop wearing that wherever it is you're from too.
Anyway,
so like, you look like an asshole.
It's just aesthetically poor.
Yeah, at least if you're gonna wear. Yeah, if you're gonna dress like a Knights Templar, I'd like you to be a lot more chiseled than you currently are, sir.
Anywho, so like, yeah, I'll take a look through this, but yeah, it's a good question here at the end, because we already, in the contextualization, make that move, the overt move of saying yeah, but humans also are stochastic parrots and, you know, pronouncers of bullshit. I mean, it's like, you know, that's what law is. It's like, yes, just as
Yeah.
you shouldn't put GPT-3 in this position of power because it makes these huge mistakes. Like, yeah, that's what humans do too. And in fact, humans sometimes do it in a conscious way that we don't ascribe to GPT-3, right? I mean, it's like when GPT-3 does this, we don't say it's like evil, the way a human who chooses corruption or chooses
Right.
to abuse people in one of myriad ways. We don't ascribe that kind of agency to the machine. It's like, oh, well, it just got bad data, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. You can't expect anything else, which, you know, is always interesting because it's like, you know, we ascribe very, and we talked about this previously, right? Where there's like the notion of like personhood with a river, or how corporations in this country have a degree of personhood. Interestingly, it's like the degree to spend unlimited money in political campaigns, but not the degree to be held responsible for their behavior. Right? It's like a
Yeah.
corporation can't be convicted of multiple murder, despite the fact that it seems to have the First Amendment.
Right.
It's
Right.
the
It's got all the
positive
good
without the
stuff.
negative.
Yeah.
But we do explicitly make, because, you know, if we didn't do that in the contextualization, it's definitely something we would do here to say, yeah, but humans have these huge flaws as well. So, you know,
Yeah. This is a perennial question. And one could make the argument that if you fed, I mean, maybe this is kind of what you're getting at. If you train GPT on a data set, it won't like willfully ignore part of that data set, right? Because you can make the case that law is just a data, like judges make decisions based on the data set of evidence and precedent,
right.
except judges could decide to ignore some of that. In fact, probably have to ignore part of that data set to make decisions, right? So in that sense, what's preferable, right? We're all trained on data. I mean, that's Ingold's notion of a taskscape, right? That your capacity for action is the function of the taskscape you find yourself in, right? There's a unrelatedly, or perhaps relatedly, there's a great it's an edited collection, and it's a scientist writing about how scientists, or maybe humans in general, have a hard time understanding like ant behavior, because we oscillate between two poles, right? Either there's a queen in charge telling them what to do, and okay, that's not true. Well, then the ants must be pre-programmed to do their roles, and that's not true either. So the idea that that essentially, right, that it's sort of an emergent phenomenon that's neither bottom up or top down, right? They're not programmed externally, but they're also not programmed internally. And those tend to be the poles with which we, you know, at least in a Western dualistic context, tend to go, right? Well, either there's someone in charge, or they're just bots following a genetically programmed, like, well, that's neither of those are true. But well, then how did they end up behaving that way? Well, because of the taskscape they find themselves in, right? It's, you know, anyway, it's right. You can't boil it down to either one or the other, right? There's just complete transcendent authority or programming, which may be kind of the anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to finish up by digging into the Bona Machina.
Yeah,
Or
that
machine.
was in part from my salsa talk.
Is that, have you coined this?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering if I'm missing something.
No, well, because I was in that other, the piece I excised it from is when I began with the anal beads and the the chess player and the vibrating ring, or the vibrating device for the poker player. So, and then Johnson's whole thing about, right, training GPT-3 so that it's, you know, good, the good bot speaking, the good machine speaking well. So, and, you know, Bona machine is kind of funny to say.
But
but that may be,
Would it be bonum or bone?
I can't remember. I think I did.
Well, because it says, well, I'm just, is it gendered?
Oh,
Is it a gendered?
ooh, I don't, that's a good question. I don't
Latin.
actually know Latin or understand it. I have
I
the two
used
B,
to.
I have the two B's I got in grad school to get my foreign language requirement done.
I would know
And maybe
this.
ask somebody.
I was gonna say, who's a classicalist who would know this?
I'll run it by Paul.
Yeah, Paul would know. He might know it through ecclesiastical school.
Yeah, yeah. Well, according to the Nicaea, it's this.
That was in high school, my Latin teacher. He was ecclesiastically trained, so, but he himself was not religious. I did not go to religious school.
Okay, the good machine in Latin. Yeah, bonum machina,
Okay.
bonum machina. I think I looked it up.
Okay.
Don't you worry.
Just didn't want to have egg on our face here.
Yeah, well, it may not end up in this thing at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, that's too.
All right. Well, so I mean, am I still sharing this?
No,
Okay.
it's just us privately looking at a Google Doc while,
That's good. That's good to
while
know.
people look at us.
Yeah, so I mean, the next step, I'll go ahead and take a pass at that. I guess I'll need to because I haven't read the Johnson, in order to kind of get the gist of that.
Yeah,
But then, I mean, then that's pretty much it, right? I mean, once we kind of decide what to do with this,
I think so. Yeah, I reread it before I wrote the conclusion.
do what?
I reread it before I edited the conclusion.
Okay.
So just to kind of make sure I build in the notion of telling and stakes.
Yeah, kind of where it
And,
starts.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we should probably, well, we can figure out what to do with that. But I could also, I'm getting close to the end of the semester here.
Yeah.
I could also start then slicing up the other sections, right? Because right now this is just a single document, but we have them in sections in
That's right.
manifold.
Yeah. And then we'll need to, I guess, get back in touch with Jeff about getting this out to.
Yeah.
We should
That's
probably also
probably-
maybe think about names we want to suggest.
Yeah, that would be a good idea so that we're not just kind of dumping it. I had on my to-do, I got to update Jeff and then something else. But yeah, that'd be a good idea to think about potential people. So it's not just, hey, here's this, you deal with it, but rather.
Yeah. And maybe
here's
one
this.
question is, do we ask some of the same people that did the first one, or do we want a whole new batch, or at least maybe one person that comes with us? Well, in part, though, a lot of the people that we had, well, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, something good.
Well, and let's see. And last time, I think he cooked up.
Yeah, he found some folks, but I can't remember if we recommended.
Yeah.
And now I'm actually drawing a blank on who our reviewers were.
Well, some of them remained
Oh, we
anonymous.
don't. That's right.
In fact, I think the only ones I could say with certainty are ones who identified themselves.
That's right. That makes sense. That's how peer review works.
Theoretically.
Theoretically.
But yeah, I mean, we should think of some suggestions and then get his feedback.
Yeah. And maybe I think what we did too, we had a mix of just people in rhetoric that we thought would be in the ballpark, but also I think some people who might also be able to speak to method.
Yeah.
Well. So thinking too about reviewers that might be, right, not, potentially interested in the whole thing, but maybe that might have different parts of it they dig into more than others.
Yeah, so folks who, I mean, I guess at least do things like, survey methods and that kind of thing, because this really is not ethnographic, it's not actually studying them as, in fact, we kind of point out this isn't that.
Right. That's more of the Ben's being a Turker, I think, as well as graphic.
Yeah, so I mean, that would be, so I'll go through that section, but yeah, we should probably think about names, and then we can, during the break, shoot a update to Jeff about, we get this, and here are some suggestions. How do you want to proceed?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's the gist of it. Are there?
No, that was, just, I think as you look through it, what needs to be, does it need to be tweaked at all? Is it need, I don't know.
But the main question is, should that stuff in red stay or go? Is that the?
I mean, my instinct is that fully goes.
Okay.
But it may be that this maybe I'll highlight this in a different color. This orange stuff might still be, or just, does what's there feel like it wraps it up? That what's in black, does that feel conclusion-y enough?
Right. Okay.
Because on the heels, I mean, that contextualization section is I dig it, and it's pretty robust.
Yeah.
I also don't want to have a conclusion that is too lengthy and potentially for a reader muddies I think the meat of that discussion, that contextualization section.
Don't want muddy meat.
Yeah, you know what? A lot of my sentences aren't clicking this morning. I will cop to that. No one likes muddy meat, as we all know. Famously, expression.
You did have a strange start to this where I said, "How are you doing?" Or no, what did I said this before we started.
Yeah. Sentence that didn't end.
Yeah, just, how are you doing? And you're just like, ooh, all right.
Yeah. I glitched a little bit.
All right, well, I guess that's our charge.
That's it.
I'm finishing up with the semester, which is always the we're going deep into the semester. The grades are due the 19th, so
yeah, I think ours are like the 20th.
Jeez.
But yeah, no, and I'm the grad class I'm teaching is the one where next semester they'll all be teaching for the first time.
Oh yeah.
So that one always ends in just a mess of panic and anxiety, and so
yeah, understandably.
That'll be great.
All right. Well,
okay.
I guess I'll take a look at this. You think about names, and we'll reconvene.
Sounds good.
All right. Take it easy.
Later.